Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're kicking off a special two-part series we call One System, Three Facilities. In this first part, we're going to look closely at facility-specific document sets, and specifically, we'll be comparing the FPSO with the fixed platform. It's actually a fascinating comparison, because while these offshore facilities look vastly different, one is a massive ship-shaped vessel floating out in the ocean, and the other is this towering steel structure pinned directly to the seafloor, their core electrical safety documentation actually starts from the exact same baseline.
Okay, let's dive into this. Whether you're walking the decks of a ship-shaped floating unit or climbing the stairs of a steel jacket fixed platform, there are three core documents that are absolutely mandatory for your compliance. We're talking about your Hazardous Area Classification, or HAC drawings, your X Equipment Register, and your Area Classification Schedule, which maps out those Zone 0, 1, and 2 hazardous areas. These three documents form the absolute bedrock of your electrical safety. They dictate exactly where explosive gas atmospheres might pop up and what equipment is actually safe to use in those areas.
But right here is where the story gets really interesting. The structure of those three core documents, it doesn't change from facility to facility, but the documentation delta is massive. What feeds into those documents and who actually signs off on them absolutely does change depending on the physical nature of the facility itself. So, think of it like this. You've got the same three binders sitting on the shelf, but the feeder data inside them is completely different.
Section 1. The FPSO Classification Layer. Adding the Marine and Hull Interface.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what we're talking about. An FPSO isn't just a processing plant, right? It's literally a ship. You've got a massive hull, you have internal cargo tanks storing hydrocarbons, and you have these incredibly complex systems like the turret and moon pool that moor the vessel and bring fluids right up from the seabed. This physical reality, storing and processing highly flammable liquids directly on top of a floating hull, directly dictates some incredibly complex documentation needs.
Because the FSO is a classed floating vessel, its HAC package carries an extra layer that other facilities simply don't have: hull and marine classification cross-referencing. The vessel itself requires independent approval for its hull and marine systems from a classification society, like DNV or ABS. So what does this mean for you? Well, if you've got electrical equipment sitting right at that marine and process interface, say near the ballast tanks, the cofferdams, or around the turret moon pool, your X Equipment Register and your HAC drawings absolutely must cross-reference those specific marine class notations too.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the X Equipment Register is actually framed. It's not just about electricity and preventing sparks anymore. It's tied directly to the vessel's marine survivability. Your feeder data has to include hull and buoyancy classification documents. It has to reference the cargo tank and ballast systems. And you need those DNV or ABS sign-offs for that critical turret and process interface. The electrical safety documentation is, for all intents and purposes, married to the marine classification.
Moving on to Section 2. Fixed platform steel tie-ins, removing the hull, relying on structure.
Contrasting these two units side by side really tells you almost everything you need to know about why their documentation differs. On one side, we have that ship-shaped FPSO hull. On the other, we have a fixed unit, like a tension leg platform. This fixed platform stands on legs, tendons, or a steel jacket. It completely lacks a floating ship hull designed for bulk oil storage. Because of that major structural difference, that heavy marine class layer we were just talking about, it mostly disappears.
A fixed platform, by contrast, has no hull to classify. You don't have to prove to a marine society that the facility is going to float, because it's a permanent steel structure standing on legs tethered right to the seabed. Consequently, the entire compliance focus for your X Equipment Register shifts. Instead of marine interfaces, your documentation ties much more directly to structural steel drawings. This establishes exactly how your equipment supports and cable trays route along the topside steel in the jacket.
Because the steel structure doesn't move and certainly doesn't require a marine buoyancy certification, the feeder data is so much more straightforward. Your primary feeder data consists of structural steel drawings, topside jacket fixed supports, and rigid cable tray routing plans. It is rigidly tied to standard structural and electrical engineering plans mapped to your standard Zone 0, 1, and 2 areas. And it's all governed by general IEC or API standards, completely without that heavy Marine Classification Society overlay.
Section 3. Let's move to our quick facility knowledge check and see how this builds.
All right, let's test your compliance understanding with a quick scenario. Let's say you are reviewing an Exit Equipment Register. You notice it has extensive cross-referencing for hull notation and marine interfaces. Based on what we just covered, which facility are you looking at? So the crucial point is, the answer is the FSPO. Because it's a classed floating vessel, it comes with a hull, cargo tanks, and marine systems that a class society like DNV or ABS must separately approve on top of your electrical HVAC package. That marine hull is literally the deciding factor for requiring that incredibly complex layer of documentation.
Section 4. Summary and what's next. Peeling the final onion layer.
Looking at this feeder data comparison, we see it all perfectly mapped out. Both the FPSO and the fixed platform share the exact same 3 baseline CompEx documents. However, the FPSO's primary feeder data relies heavily on the hull, tanks, and turret, requiring a rigorous marine-class regulatory layer from societies like DNV or ABS simply because it's a classed vessel. The fixed platform, on the other hand, relies on structural steel and jackets as its feeder data, falling entirely under standard IEC and API regulatory layers since there's no hull to classify. You now perfectly understand the delta between these two major offshore environments.
But we definitely aren't done yet. In part 2 of this explainer, we bring in the MODU, or Mobile Offshore Drilling Unit. It is the facility with the most document complexity of all 3, thanks to its mobile, multi-jurisdictional nature. Think about it for a second. If an FPSO is complex just because it floats, what happens to your baseline safety documentation when the facility itself can physically pack up, move across the ocean, and operate in completely different countries and jurisdictions? How do you maintain compliance for a hazard that constantly changes its zip code? Join us for part 2 to find out.